The Aztecs built floating gardens that fed hundreds of thousands. They created a city larger than any in Europe at the time. Their warriors wore jaguar skins and eagle feathers. They watched the stars and predicted eclipses with stunning accuracy. They built pyramids that touched the clouds. Their empire stretched from ocean to ocean across what we now call Mexico. This is their complete story. Long before the grand temples rose above the waters of Lake Texcoco, the people who had become the Aztecs lived far to the north. They called themselves the Mexica. Their homeland was Aztlan, a place shrouded in mystery and legend. Some say Aztlan was an island surrounded by water. Others describe it as a land of 7 caves. The exact location remains unknown to this day. Perhaps it existed in what is now the southwestern United States. Perhaps it was purely mythological. What matters is that the Mexica believed in it completely. In Aztlan, life was different. The people lived simply. They fished in the waters. They hunted birds with nets. They gathered plants from the marshes. According to their own histories, they lived there for many generations. Some accounts say they dwelt in Aztlan for more than 1,000 years. During this time, they were not yet the powerful warriors they would become. They were one tribe among many. The land of Aztlan was said to be a paradise. White herons filled the skies. The waters were full of fish. Reeds and rushes grew thick along the shores. The people lived in houses made of reeds and mud. They travelled in canoes through the waterways. Disease was unknown. People lived to great ages. Some stories claim that in Aztlan no one grew old. Women remained beautiful. Men stayed strong. This was before hardship entered their lives. But paradise never lasts forever. The year was approximately 1111 according to later calculations. Something changed in Aztlan. The stories differ on what exactly happened. Some say the Mexica's god, Huitzilopochtli, appeared to the tribal priest in dreams. He commanded them to leave their homeland. He promised them greatness if they obeyed. He told them they would become lords of all the world. Other accounts suggest conflicts arose with neighbouring tribes. Perhaps resources became scarce. Perhaps the population grew too large. Perhaps both divine command and earthly necessity pushed them to move. The Mexica were not alone in their departure. 7 tribes left the caves of Chicamostoc together. Each tribe had its own identity. The Xochimilca would later settle on the southern shores of the Great Lake. The Chalca would establish themselves to the east. The Tepaneca would become powerful rivals. The Tlalhuica headed south. The Tlaxcalans went east. The Acolua settled in the eastern valley. And the Mexica, the last to leave, would wander the longest. Chicamostoc, the place of 7 caves, holds special meaning in Aztec mythology. Each cave housed one of the tribes. The caves were wombs of the earth. From these wombs, the tribes were born into the world. Paintings in later Aztec books show Chicamostoc as a mountain with 7 openings. From each opening emerges a different tribe. The Mexica emerged last, marked by destiny for their special role in history. The god Huitzilopochtli became the Mexica's guide. His name means hummingbird of the south, or hummingbird on the left. He was a god of war and the sun. Every morning he battled the forces of night to bring daylight to the world. The Mexica carried his image with them in a sacred bundle. Only the highest priests could look upon this bundle. It contained the god's bones, or perhaps his image carved in wood. This bundle would guide them through their long journey. Before leaving Aztlan, the priests performed rituals. They fasted for days. They pierced their skin with cactus thorns to offer blood to the gods. They burned incense made from tree resin. The smoke carried their prayers to the heavens. They asked for guidance. They asked for protection. They asked for the strength to complete the journey ahead. The god Huitzilopochtli spoke through the priests. He made promises. The Mexica would rule over all other peoples. They would receive tribute from distant lands. Their city would be the greatest ever built. But first they must suffer. They must wander. They must prove themselves worthy. The departure from Aztlan was not hurried. Preparations took months, perhaps years. The people gathered their possessions. They prepared travelling food, dried corn, beans, squash seeds, and strips of dried meat. They made new sandals from plant fibres. They wove carrying baskets. They selected their strongest men to carry the sacred bundles. Women prepared extra clothing for the journey. Children old enough to walk practiced travelling in groups. Elders shared stories of the world beyond Aztlan, though few had ever left their homeland. The social structure of the early Mexica was simpler than what it would later become. They had leaders called calpulec, heads of family groups. These leaders formed a council. The council made decisions for the tribe. They had priests who interpreted signs and communicated with the gods. They had warriors who protected the group, but they did not yet have the complex hierarchy of nobles, priests, warriors, merchants, artisans, farmers, and slaves that would characterize the Aztec Empire at its height. As they prepared to leave, omens appeared. An eagle circled overhead for 7 days. A comet streaked across the night sky. A spring that had always run clear suddenly turned red like blood. The priests interpreted these signs. The eagle represented their warrior destiny. The comet showed the path they should follow. The red water symbolized the blood they would shed and the sacrifices they would make. Everything pointed to a great but difficult destiny ahead. The Mexicans' understanding of the world shaped their journey. They believed the earth was a flat disk surrounded by water. The sky was held up by 4 gods at the cardinal directions. Below the earth were 9 levels of the underworld. Above were 13 levels of heaven. They were leaving the center of their known world to venture into unknown territories. This took enormous courage and faith. On the day of departure, the entire tribe gathered. The priests performed one final ceremony in Aztlan. They offered flowers, feathers, and drops of blood to the sacred directions, east, west, north, and south. They thanked the land that had sheltered them. They asked forgiveness for leaving. They promised to remember Aztlan always. Then, carrying their few possessions and their sacred bundles, they began walking south. The early stages of the migration were the hardest. The Mexica had to learn to be nomads. They had lived in one place for generations. Now they had to find new sources of water each day. They had to identify edible plants in unfamiliar territories. They had to negotiate passage through lands claimed by other tribes. Sometimes they were welcomed. Sometimes they had to fight. Sometimes they had to flee. The sacred bundle of Huitzilopochtli was carried at the front of the migration. 4 priests took turns bearing this burden. They were called the Teomamac, the god-bearers. These priests spoke to no one except to relay the gods' commands. They ate separately from the rest of the tribe. They slept apart. They maintained ritual purity through constant prayer and bloodletting. The bundle was never allowed to touch the ground. At night it was placed on a special platform. Guards watched it constantly. As they travelled, the Mexica began to change. The soft life of Aztlan was left behind. Their feet grew hard from walking on rough ground. Their skin darkened and toughened under the sun. They learned to survive on less food. They became expert at finding water in dry lands. They learned the arts of war from necessity. Young boys who began the journey grew into warriors along the way. Girls became women, bearing children even as the tribe continued to move. The journey was not continuous. Sometimes the Mexica would settle in a place for years. They would plant crops and build temporary homes. Children would be born. Elders would die and be buried in foreign soil. Then Huitzilopochtli would command them to move again. The priest would announce the god's will. The people would pack their belongings. The journey would resume. During these stops, the Mexica encountered other peoples. They learned new techniques for farming. They discovered different ways to prepare food. They observed various styles of building. They heard stories of great cities to the south. They learned about the Toltecs, the legendary civilization that had ruled central Mexico before collapsing. They heard about Tollan, the Toltec capital, with its enormous pyramids and palaces. These stories fired their imagination. Perhaps they too could build such a city one day. The Mexica also learned about the complex religious and political landscape of central Mexico. They discovered that many gods were worshipped by different peoples. Some of these gods they adopted into their own pantheon. They learned about Tlaloc, the rain god, ancient and powerful. They heard of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, god of wind and learning. They discovered Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, god of conflict and change. These gods would become central to Aztec religion, but during the migration the Mexica were just beginning to understand their importance. Language was another tool the Mexica refined during their migration. They spoke Nahuatl, a language shared by many peoples in central Mexico, but each group had its own dialect and variations. As the Mexica encountered different tribes, they had to learn to communicate across these differences. They became skilled negotiators and diplomats out of necessity. They learned to read the political situations of the places they passed through. This knowledge would serve them well in the future. The role of women during the migration was crucial but often overlooked in later histories. Women maintained the cultural traditions of the tribe. They taught children the Mexica language and customs. They prepared traditional foods even with unfamiliar ingredients. They wove clothing in Mexica patterns. They preserved the stories and songs of Aztlan. They also bore the burden of pregnancy and childbirth while travelling. Many women died during the journey. They were honoured as warriors who had fallen in battle, the battle to bring new life into the world. The Mexica's calendar system travelled with them. They tracked the solar year of 365 days and the ritual calendar of 260 days. The combination of these two calendars created a 52-year cycle. The priests maintained this count throughout the migration. They knew which days were favourable for travel. They knew when to plant and when to harvest. They knew when to perform specific rituals. This calendar connected them to their past in Aztlan and would continue into their future in Tenochtitlan. The path from Aztlan to central Mexico was neither straight nor simple. The Mexica wandered for over 200 years. Each generation knew only the journey. Children were born on the road. They grew up hearing stories of Aztlan, a place they had never seen. They died still travelling, never seeing the promised land their God had described. This was a people defined by movement, shaped by constant change, strengthened by perpetual challenge. After leaving Chicomostoc, the Mexica first arrived at a place called Cotepec, meaning Snake Mountain. Here, something dramatic happened that would define their identity forever. According to their histories, this was where Huitzilopochtli was truly born as their supreme deity. The story tells of conflict among the wandering Mexica. A group of malcontents, led by a sorceress named Coyolxauhqui and her 400 brothers, decided they had travelled far enough. They wanted to settle at Cotepec permanently. They plotted against the priests who insisted the journey must continue. The rebellion at Cotepec turned violent. Coyolxauhqui and her brothers moved to kill the priests and destroy the sacred bundle. But Huitzilopochtli manifested in his full power. In some versions of the story, he was born fully grown from his mother, dressed in warrior garb, wielding weapons of fire and obsidian. He struck down Coyolxauhqui, dismembering her body. He scattered the 400 brothers like leaves before a hurricane. This event established Huitzilopochtli as a god who demanded absolute obedience. It also showed that the Mexica's destiny could not be denied or altered by human will. After Cotepec, the Mexica continued south. They passed through lands that would later become part of their empire. They saw the ruins of older civilizations, abandoned pyramids covered in vegetation, empty palaces with painted walls peeling and fading, broken statues of forgotten gods. These ruins served as both warning and inspiration. Great civilizations had risen here before. They had fallen. The Mexica could be next to rise, but they must learn from the failures of the past. The tribe's numbers fluctuated during the migration. Sometimes disease would strike, killing dozens or hundreds. Sometimes groups would split off, deciding to settle in promising locations. Sometimes the Mexica would absorb smaller groups they encountered, adding to their population. They were not racially pure or culturally isolated. They were a mixing pot, constantly incorporating new blood and new ideas. This flexibility would become one of their greatest strengths. Around 1250, the Mexica reached the northern edges of the Valley of Mexico. This was not an empty wilderness awaiting settlers. The valley was already home to numerous city-states. Culhuacan claimed descent from the Toltecs. Azcapotzalco was growing in power. Texcoco controlled the eastern shores of the Great Lake. Xochimilco and Chalco dominated the south. The Mexica were latecomers to an already crowded and politically complex region. The Valley of Mexico was unlike anything the Mexica had encountered. A series of connected lakes covered much of the valley floor. Lake Texcoco was the largest, with brackish water unsuitable for drinking but teeming with fish, birds, and other resources. Lake Xochimilco and Lake Chalco to the south contained fresh water. Lake Zaltican and Lake Zumpango to the north were smaller but still significant. Islands dotted these lakes. Marshes and wetlands bordered them. It was a landscape reminiscent of the Aztlan they had left behind, but on a much grander scale. The established cities did not welcome the Mexica with open arms. These newcomers were seen as barbarians, crude and uncivilized. They dressed in rough maguey fiber clothing instead of fine cotton. They spoke Nahuatl with a provincial accent. They lacked knowledge of the sophisticated political and religious protocols of the valley. They were mockingly called people without faces, meaning they had no established identity or reputation. The Mexica first sought permission to settle in Chapultepec, a hill on the western shore of Lake Texcoco. Chapultepec means Grasshopper Hill. It had strategic value, rising above the surrounding landscape with springs of fresh water. The local rulers grudgingly allowed the Mexica to stay, but only temporarily. The Mexica built simple shelters and planted crops. For perhaps 20 years they lived at Chapultepec, always under the suspicious eyes of their neighbors. During their time at Chapultepec, the Mexica began learning the ways of the Valley of Mexico. They observed the chinampas, the artificial agricultural islands that produced amazing harvests. They studied the complex system of dikes and causeways that controlled water levels in the lakes. They learned about the tribute system, where weaker cities paid goods and services to stronger ones. They watched the Posteca, the long-distance merchants who brought exotic goods from far lands. They began to understand the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that governed valley politics. The Mexica also started developing their military skills in earnest. They served as mercenaries for various city-states. They learned the valley's way of war. Warriors wore padded cotton armor that could stop obsidian blades. They used wooden swords edged with obsidian sharper than steel. They employed spear throwers called atlatls to launch darts with deadly force. They learned the importance of taking captives rather than killing enemies. Captives could be sacrificed to the gods, bringing spiritual power. Dead enemies brought nothing but temporary victory. But the Mexica's growing strength worried their neighbors. A coalition formed against them. Armies from multiple cities converged on Chapultepec. The Mexica fought bravely but were overwhelmed. Their crude fortifications were overrun. Many were killed. Many more were captured. The survivors scattered. Their leader was taken prisoner and later sacrificed. It seemed the Mexica's journey might end in disaster. The scattered Mexica refugees sought protection wherever they could find it. The largest group approached Culhuacan, the city that claimed Toltec heritage. The ruler of Culhuacan, Coxcox, agreed to give them refuge, but only on humiliating terms. They were settled in Tizapan, a miserable place infested with poisonous snakes and biting insects. The land was rocky and barren. It seemed unsuitable for human habitation. Coxcox expected the Mexica to either flee or die. Instead, the Mexica thrived in Tizapan. They ate the snakes, finding them nutritious. They learned to avoid or repel the dangerous insects. They broke up the rocky ground and created productive gardens. They built stone houses that stayed cool in the heat and warm in the cold. They turned adversity into advantage. This ability to flourish in the worst conditions would become a defining characteristic of the Mexica people. While in Tizapan, the Mexica continued serving as mercenaries. They fought for Culhuacan against its enemies. They proved themselves fierce and reliable warriors. They began earning respect, if not affection. Some Mexica men married Culhua women. These marriages were important because Culhuacan's claimed Toltec bloodline gave prestige. The children of these unions could claim descent from the legendary Toltecs. This would become crucial for establishing Aztec legitimacy later. The Mexica spent perhaps 25 years in Tizapan. A new generation grew up there. They were not nomads like their parents. They knew a settled life, even if in a harsh place. They spoke Nahuatl with the accent of the valley. They understood the religious and cultural practices of central Mexico. They were becoming civilized by local standards, but they remained outsiders, tolerated rather than accepted. The event that ended the Mexica's time in Tizapan was shocking even by the violent standards of the age. According to their god Huitzilopochtli's command, the Mexica asked Coxcox for his daughter to become a bride to their god. Cox agreed, thinking this was a great honor. But the Mexica sacrificed the princess and flayed her skin. A priest wore this skin in a religious ceremony. When Cox discovered what had happened to his daughter, his rage was volcanic. The Mexica had to flee immediately or face complete annihilation. This brutal act requires understanding within its cultural context. Human sacrifice was practiced throughout Mesoamerica. The flaying ritual was associated with Xipe-Totec, the god of spring and renewal. By wearing the skin of a sacrificial victim, priests symbolically showed how the earth puts on a new coat of vegetation each spring. The Mexica may have thought they were honoring Cox's daughter by making her divine, but to Cox it was an unforgivable atrocity. The Mexica fled Tizapan in the night. They ran toward the lakes pursued by Culhua warriors. They waded through marshes and swamps. They hid among the reeds and rushes. Some accounts say they spent days standing in water up to their necks, breathing through hollow reeds to avoid detection. They had lost everything again. Their houses, their gardens, their accumulated possessions, all abandoned in their flight. With nowhere else to go, the Mexica took refuge on uninhabited islands in Lake Texcoco. These islands were unwanted by other cities. They flooded during the rainy season. They were far from fresh water sources. They were plagued by mosquitoes. The soil was salty and seemed unsuitable for agriculture. Once again, the Mexica were given the worst possible land. Once again, they would have to make something from nothing. The year was approximately 1325. The Mexica had been wandering for over 2 centuries. They had been in the Valley of Mexico for perhaps 75 years. They had been driven from place to place, never welcome, always struggling. But their trials were about to end. On one of these miserable islands they would see the sign their god had promised. They would build their city. They would begin their rise to power. During their wanderings, the Mexica had developed crucial characteristics. They were tough, able to survive conditions that would destroy other peoples. They were adaptable, learning from each culture they encountered. They were disciplined, maintaining their identity despite generations of displacement. They were ambitious, never forgetting the promises of greatness their god had made. They were pragmatic, willing to do whatever was necessary to survive and advance. These traits, forged through 2 centuries of hardship, would enable them to build an empire. The religious practices of the Mexica had also evolved during the migration. Huitzilopochtli remained supreme, but they had incorporated other deities. They had learned elaborate rituals and ceremonies. They had developed a sophisticated understanding of the sacred calendar. They had created a priestly class dedicated to maintaining religious knowledge. Their religion had become a complex system that could unite diverse peoples under a common cosmic vision. The Mexica's language had been enriched during their travels. They had borrowed words from other tongues. They had developed new terms for concepts they had discovered. They had created a rich oral literature of songs, poems, and stories. They had refined their rhetorical skills through generations of negotiation and diplomacy. Nahuatl, as spoken by the Mexica, was becoming a prestige dialect that would eventually dominate central Mexico. The morning mist hung low over Lake Texcoco. The Mexica huddled on their swampy islands, wondering if this miserable place would be yet another temporary stop in their endless journey. Then, according to their sacred history, the sign appeared. On a small island, barely more than a rocky outcrop surrounded by marsh, stood a nopal cactus. Perched on this cactus was an eagle, magnificent and proud. In its talons it held a serpent still writhing. The eagle spread its wings and screamed at the rising sun. This was the vision Huitzilopochtli had promised. After more than 200 years of wandering, the Mexica had found their destined home. The priests fell to their knees in gratitude. Warriors shouted in triumph. Women wept with relief. Children stared in wonder at the eagle, which seemed to glow in the morning light. The serpent stopped struggling as if accepting its fate. The eagle swallowed it whole, then flew away toward the east. The exact date was carefully recorded. It was the year second house in the Mexica calendar, corresponding to 1325 in European reckoning. Some sources say it was the second day of the month Etimostli. The location of the vision became the sacred center of what would become Tenochtitlan. Here they would build their first temple. Here the 4 cardinal directions would meet. Here the earthly and divine realms would connect. The name Tenochtitlan has multiple interpretations. Some say it means place of the nopal cactus. Others translate it as place of Tenoch, honouring an early Mexica leader. Still others suggest it means stone rising from water. All these meanings were probably intended. The Mexica delighted in wordplay and multiple meanings. Their city's name could simultaneously honour their leader, describe their environment, and commemorate their divine sign. The island was far from ideal for settlement. It measured perhaps 2.5 square miles. Much of it was marsh rather than solid ground. Fresh water had to be brought from springs on the mainland. Building materials were scarce. The soil was salty and alkaline. During the rainy season, lake waters could rise and flood everything. During the dry season, the exposed mudflats stank of rotting vegetation and dead fish. But the Mexica saw advantages where others saw only problems. The island's isolation provided defence against enemies. The surrounding water offered fish, waterfowl, salamanders, algae, and other foods. The location at the centre of the lake system allowed easy canoe travel in all directions. The marshy soil, once properly prepared, could be incredibly fertile. The Mexica had spent generations learning to thrive in difficult conditions. This island would be their greatest challenge and their greatest triumph. The first structures were simple reed huts, not different from what the Mexica had built during their migrations. But from the beginning they planned for permanence. They laid out the city according to cosmic principles. The temple to Huitzilopochtli would stand at the centre. 4 causeways would extend toward the cardinal directions. The city would be divided into 4 quarters, each with its own identity and leadership. The 4 quarters were called Campan in Nahuatl. Myotlan occupied the southwest, named for the mosquitoes that plagued that area. Teopan, meaning place of the gods, was in the southeast. Atzacoalco, place of the herons, was in the northeast. Quepopan, possibly meaning place of flowers, was in the northwest. Each quarter was further divided into smaller neighbourhoods called Calpuli. These Calpulli were based on kinship groups that had travelled together during the migration. Building Tenochtitlan required innovation. The Mexica developed new construction techniques suited to their environment. They drove wooden pilings deep into the lake bed to create stable foundations. They built up land using layers of rock, gravel, and earth. They created a network of canals for transportation. Every piece of solid ground was precious. Every building site had to be carefully prepared. The Chinampa system became the foundation of Tenochtitlan's growth. Chinampas were artificial islands created for agriculture. The Mexica had observed this technique in other lake cities, but they perfected it. They started by driving stakes into the shallow lake bed in a rectangular pattern. They wove branches and reeds between the stakes to create walls. They filled the enclosure with layers of mud, decaying vegetation and human waste. They planted willow trees at the corners whose roots would stabilize the structure. Each Chinampa measured approximately 90 feet by 30 feet. Narrow canals separated them, allowing canoe access for maintenance and harvest. The Chinampas were incredibly productive. The combination of rich soil, abundant water, and careful tending allowed multiple harvests per year. Corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, chili peppers, and flowers grew in abundance. A single Chinampa could feed a family with surplus to trade. Fresh water was Tenochtitlan's most pressing need. Lake Texcoco was brackish, its water undrinkable. The Mexica initially relied on canoes to bring water from mainland springs. This was inefficient and left them vulnerable to siege. The solution came during the reign of Chimalpopoca, the third Mexica ruler. They built an aqueduct from Chapultepec where springs provided clean water. This engineering marvel stretched over 3 miles, supported by a causeway that also served as a road. The early decades of Tenochtitlan were precarious. The Mexica remained subordinate to more powerful neighbours. They paid tribute to Azcapotzalco, the dominant power on the western shore. They provided warriors for Azcapotzalco's wars. They sent labourers for Azcapotzalco's building projects. They were still the despised newcomers, barely tolerated by the established cities. The Mexica's first recognised ruler was Acamapichtli, who took power around 1375. He was chosen for his bloodline, which connected to Culhuacan's claimed Toltec heritage. This gave the Mexica legitimacy they had previously lacked. Acamapichtli ruled for about 20 years. Under his leadership, Tenochtitlan grew from a collection of reed huts to a proper city with stone buildings, defined streets, and functioning government. Huitzilopochtli succeeded his father Akamapishtli around 1395. His reign saw Tenochtitlan's first major diplomatic success. He married the daughter of Tezozomoc, the powerful ruler of Azcapotzalco. This marriage alliance reduced the tribute Tenochtitlan had to pay. It also gave the Mexica protection under Azcapotzalco's military might. Huitzilopochtli used this breathing room to strengthen Tenochtitlan internally. During these early reigns, Tenochtitlan developed its governmental structure. The ruler, called Huitlatuni, meaning great speaker, held supreme authority, but he was advised by a council of nobles and priests. Important decisions required consensus among the leadership. The Kalpali maintained local governance. Each had its own temple, school, and administrative building. This balance between central authority and local autonomy would characterize Aztec governance throughout the empire's existence. The sister city of Tlatelolco deserves special attention. Founded shortly after Tenochtitlan on a nearby island, Tlatelolco was settled by a different faction of Mexica. While Tenochtitlan focused on military and political power, Tlatelolco became a commercial center. Its market would eventually become the largest in Mesoamerica. The relationship between the twin cities was complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive, always intertwined. Religion shaped every aspect of early Tenochtitlan. The first temple to Huitzilopochtli was modest, built of mud brick and thatch, but it stood at the exact center of the universe according to Mexica cosmology. Here, priests performed daily rituals to ensure the sun would rise. They offered blood from their own bodies, piercing their tongues, earlobes, and genitals with cactus spines. They burned copal incense that carried prayers to the heavens. They sacrificed quail, dogs, and occasionally humans to feed the gods. The Mexica calendar governed religious and civil life. The solar calendar of 365 days determined agricultural activities and seasonal festivals. The ritual calendar of 260 days set the timing for religious ceremonies. Every 52 years, when both calendars aligned, the Mexica performed the new fire ceremony. All fires were extinguished. The city waited in darkness. Priests kindled new fire on a sacrificial victim's chest. This fire was distributed to relight every hearth. The ceremony ensured the world would continue for another cycle. Education began early in Tenochtitlan. Boys and girls attended different schools with different purposes. The Telpochcali, or youth house, trained common boys in warfare, crafts, and civic duties. The Karmakak, or lineage house, educated noble boys in religion, government, and high culture. Girls learned domestic skills, weaving, and religious duties. Some exceptional students, regardless of birth, could advance to higher learning in medicine, astronomy, or pictographic writing. The Mexica writing system combined pictographs and ideograms. They could record names, dates, places, and basic concepts. Complex ideas required oral explanation accompanying the written symbols. Scribes called Tlaquilocue created books called codices on bark paper or animal skin. These codices recorded history, religious knowledge, tribute lists, and genealogies. Most would be destroyed by Spanish conquistadors, but a few survived to provide windows into Aztec thought. Trade networks began forming even in early Tenochtitlan. The Mexica exchanged fish, waterfowl, and salt from the lake for wood, stone, and agricultural products from the mainland. They traded crafted goods like reed mats and pottery for raw materials. As the city grew, these trade relationships became more sophisticated. The Pochteca merchant class emerged, organizing long-distance trading expeditions that were part commerce, part espionage, part diplomacy. Social stratification developed rapidly in Tenochtitlan. At the top were the Pipiltin, the nobility who claimed descent from the first Mexica leaders. Below them were the Macehaltin, commoners who formed the bulk of the population. These included farmers, craftsmen, workers, and warriors. At the bottom were the Tlacotin, slaves who were usually war captives or people who had sold themselves to pay debts. Unlike slavery in many cultures, Aztec slavery was not hereditary. Children of slaves were born free. Slaves could own property and buy their freedom. Marriage customs in early Tenochtitlan reflected both practical needs and religious beliefs. Most commoners were monogamous, though wealthy men could have multiple wives. Marriage was arranged by families, but the couple's consent was required. The ceremony involved tying the man's cloak to the woman's blouse, symbolizing their union. Divorce was possible but discouraged. Women retained property rights after marriage. Widows could remarry or remain independent. The daily life of ordinary Mexica in early Tenochtitlan followed predictable patterns. People rose before dawn. Men headed to their chinampas or workshops. Women prepared the morning meal of atole, a corn porridge flavored with chili or honey. Children helped with simple tasks before attending school. The main meal came in mid-afternoon when the day's heat peaked. Evenings were for family activities, storytelling, and preparing for the next day. Food in Tenochtitlan was more varied than many imagine. Corn was the staple, prepared as tortillas, tamales, or porridge. Beans provided protein. Squash, tomatoes, and chili peppers added flavor and nutrition. The lake provided fish, frogs, salamanders, and water insects. Dogs and turkeys were raised for meat. Algae was harvested and dried into cakes rich in protein. Cacao beans, when available, were ground into a bitter chocolate drink reserved for nobility. Clothing marked social status and occupation. Common men wore a loincloth called maxtlatl and a cloak called tilmatli. The quality of fabric and decoration indicated wealth and rank. Women wore a skirt called cuitl and a blouse called huipil. Warriors earned the right to wear specific designs and materials through battlefield achievements. Priests dressed in black, often stained with blood from sacrificial rituals. Merchants displayed their wealth through fine cotton and exotic feathers. The Mexica concept of cleanliness surprised later European observers. They bathed frequently in the lake or in steam baths called temazcali. They used soap made from the roots of the Capalxocotl tree. They cleaned their teeth with salt and charcoal. Houses were swept daily. Human waste was collected for use as fertilizer rather than left in the streets. This attention to hygiene helped prevent many diseases that plagued European cities. Medicine in early Tenochtitlan combined practical knowledge with religious belief. Healers called tisitl understood the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants. They could set broken bones, stitch wounds, and perform simple surgeries. They treated fevers with willow bark, containing the same compound as aspirin. But they also believed illness could result from divine displeasure or sorcery. Treatment often included prayers, offerings, and ritual cleansing along with herbal remedies. The role of women in Tenochtitlan was complex and often contradictory. They were excluded from formal political power but influenced decisions through their husbands and sons. They could not be warriors but were honored as the mothers of warriors. They owned property and ran businesses but were expected to be modest and domestic. Skilled weavers, midwives, and priestesses commanded respect. Women who died in childbirth were honored equally with warriors who died in battle. Children in Tenochtitlan lived structured lives from an early age. By age 3, boys were given tiny tools and girls received miniature weaving equipment. By 5, they performed real household tasks. Punishment for misbehavior could be harsh, including being held over burning chili peppers or pricked with cactus spines. But parents also showed affection through elaborate speeches called huehuetlatoli, passing down wisdom and values. The Mexica understanding of death shaped their daily lives. They believed the manner of death, not the manner of life, determined one's afterlife destination. Warriors who died in battle and women who died in childbirth went to the sun's paradise. Those who drowned went to Tlaloc's paradise. Most people went to Mictlan, the underworld, where they faced a 4-year journey through 9 levels of challenges. Art in early Tenochtitlan served religious and political purposes more than aesthetic ones. Sculptors carved images of gods and rulers from volcanic stone. Painters decorated temple walls with scenes of mythology and history. Featherworkers created elaborate headdresses and cloaks. Goldsmiths and silversmiths, though less common in the early period, produced jewellery and ritual objects. Every artistic creation had meaning beyond its appearance. Music and dance were integral to Mexica life. Drums called huehuetl and teponaztli provided rhythm. Flutes, whistles, and rattles added melody. Conch shells announced important events. Every ceremony had its specific songs and dances. Professional musicians and dancers trained from childhood. Music accompanied work, worship, war, and celebration. The Mexica believed sound could bridge the human and divine worlds. The growth of Tenochtitlan required constant construction. Building a city on swampy islands demanded continuous maintenance and expansion. Canals needed dredging. Foundations required reinforcement. New chinampas were constantly under construction. This work was organized through the Calpulli system. Each neighborhood contributed labor for public projects. This collective effort, called tequitl, built temples, causeways, and aqueducts. By 1400, Tenochtitlan had transformed from a refugee settlement to a proper city. Stone buildings replaced reed huts. Defined streets and canals created urban order. The temple to Huitzilopochtli, though still modest compared to what it would become, dominated the skyline. The population had grown to perhaps 15,000 people. The Mexica were no longer nomads or refugees. They were citizens of a growing city-state, but Tenochtitlan remained subordinate to Azcapotzalco. The tribute demands grew heavier as Tenochtitlan prospered. Tezozomoc, Azcapotzalco's ruler, watched the island city's growth with suspicion. He understood that a strong Tenochtitlan could threaten his dominance. He began playing Tenochtitlan against other cities, hoping to keep all of them weak. This strategy would ultimately backfire. The third ruler of Tenochtitlan, Chimalpopoca, came to power around 1415. He was young, possibly Tezozomoc's grandson through his mother. This family connection initially benefited Tenochtitlan, but when Tezozomoc died in 1426, succession disputes erupted in Azcapotzalco. Chimalpopoca was caught in the conflict. He was either murdered or forced to commit suicide. Tenochtitlan faced its greatest crisis since the founding. The Mexican nobility acted quickly. They selected Itzcoatl, an experienced warrior and politician, as the new Huey Tlatoani. Itzcoatl understood that Tenochtitlan could not survive alone against Azcapotzalco. He began secret negotiations with Nezahualcoyotl, the exiled prince of Texcoco. He also approached Tlacopan, a smaller city dissatisfied with Azcapotzalco's dominance. Together, they would form an alliance that would change the Valley of Mexico forever. The year 1428 marked the turning point in Mexica history. Itzcoatl stood before the assembled warriors of Tenochtitlan. Behind him rose the temple of Huitzilopochtli. Before him stretched the plaza where his people gathered. His voice carried across the crowd as he declared independence from Azcapotzalco. No more tribute, no more humiliation, no more subordination. The Mexica would be free or they would die fighting. The odds seemed impossible. Azcapotzalco commanded the western shore of the lake system. Its armies had conquered dozens of cities. Its wealth from tribute seemed limitless. Maxtla, who had seized power after Tezozomoc's death, commanded veteran warriors and established fortifications. Tenochtitlan was still a small island city with limited resources and few allies. Most observers expected the Mexica to be crushed within weeks, but Itzcoatl had prepared carefully. His alliance with Nezahualcoyotl of Texcoco brought legitimacy and resources. Nezahualcoyotl's father had been murdered by Tezozomoc years earlier. The prince had spent years in exile, building support for his eventual return. He commanded loyalty from many eastern cities that resented Azcapotzalco's dominance. His knowledge of philosophy, poetry, and law earned respect even from enemies. This was not just a military alliance, but a meeting of complementary strengths. Tlacopan, the third member of what would become the Triple Alliance, was smaller but strategically important. Located on the western shore, it could provide intelligence about Azcapotzalco's movements. Its rulers had marriage ties to both Tenochtitlan and Texcoco. While it would always be the junior partner, Tlacopan's participation gave the alliance geographic reach around the entire lake system. The war began with Azcapotzalco's blockade of Tenochtitlan. Maxtla's forces prevented food and water from reaching the island city. The aqueduct from Chapultepec was cut. Canoes carrying supplies were intercepted. The strategy was to starve Tenochtitlan into submission without costly direct assault. Maxtla expected hunger and thirst to break Mexica resistance within days. The Mexica response demonstrated their resourcefulness. They intensified fishing in the lake. They harvested every edible plant from their chinampas. They collected and filtered rainwater. They sent swimmers and small canoes through the blockade at night to gather supplies. Women and children joined the defense effort, making weapons and preparing defenses. The entire population united in resistance. Meanwhile, Nezahualcóyotl rallied the eastern cities. His forces attacked Azcapotzalco's tributaries, forcing Maxtla to divide his armies. Tlacopan provided intelligence about weak points in Azcapotzalco's defenses. The alliance coordinated their attacks, striking simultaneously from different directions. This strategic sophistication surprised Azcapotzalco's commanders, who had expected uncoordinated resistance. The decisive battle came after 114 days of war. The Allied forces converged on Azcapotzalco itself. Mexica warriors, lean from months of limited rations but burning with determination, led the assault. They fought with a ferocity that shocked even their allies. The Jaguar and Eagle warriors, elite Mexica military orders, broke through Azcapotzalco's defenses. Street by street, temple by temple, they conquered the city. Maxtla fled as his capital burned. He was later captured and sacrificed to Huitzilopochtli. Azcapotzalco was not destroyed but reduced to tributary status. Its wealth, accumulated over generations, was divided among the victors. Tenochtitlan received the largest share, 40%. Texcoco received 40%. Tlacopan received 20%. This division would remain throughout the Triple Alliance's existence. The victory transformed Tenochtitlan's position instantly. From desperate tributary, the Mexica became dominant power. Cities that had scorned them now sent ambassadors seeking alliance. The wealth from Azcapotzalco's treasury funded massive construction projects. The Mexica could finally build the grand city their god had promised. But Itzcoatl understood that military victory alone would not secure lasting power. The new political structure balanced cooperation with independence. Each member of the Triple Alliance maintained internal autonomy. They had their own rulers, laws, and religious practices, but they coordinated foreign policy and military campaigns. They shared tribute from conquered territories according to the established percentages. They supported each other against rebellions. This flexible structure proved more durable than rigid empire. Itzcoatl also reformed Tenochtitlan's internal structure. He redistributed conquered lands to reward warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle. He created new noble titles and privileges. He established military schools to train future generations of warriors. He commissioned new histories that emphasized Mexica destiny and divine favor. Some scholars believe he ordered older histories burned, replacing them with versions that glorified the Mexica past. The economic transformation was equally dramatic. Tribute flowed into Tenochtitlan from conquered cities. Cotton, cacao, precious feathers, gold, jade, and countless other goods arrived daily. The market at Tlatelolco expanded rapidly. Merchants gained wealth and influence. Craftsmen had access to materials previously unavailable. The standard of living rose for all social classes, though inequality also increased. Nezahualcóyotl proved an invaluable ally beyond military matters. His legal code influenced justice throughout the alliance. His patronage of arts and learning elevated cultural standards. His engineering projects, including dikes to control lake levels, benefited all lake cities. His botanical and zoological gardens preserved knowledge of plants and animals. His poetry and philosophy added intellectual depth to the alliance's power. The religious implications of victory were profound. Huitzilopochtli had delivered on his promises. The Mexica were no longer wanderers but rulers. The god of war had defeated the gods of their enemies. This divine validation justified expansion and sacrifice. More captives meant more offerings to ensure continued divine favor. The cycle of conquest, sacrifice, and divine support became central to Aztec ideology. Construction began on a new temple to Huitzilopochtli. This would not be the modest shrine of early Tenochtitlan, but a massive pyramid worthy of the Mexica's new status. The project required thousands of workers and vast quantities of stone. Each construction phase coincided with military victories, incorporating symbolic elements from conquered cultures. The temple became a physical manifestation of Mexica dominance. The Triple Alliance's military organization evolved rapidly. The basic unit was the Calpulli Company of about 100 warriors. 20 companies formed a division of 2,000. Multiple divisions could combine for major campaigns. Warriors advanced through ranks based on captives taken. Taking 4 captives earned eagle or jaguar warrior status. Command positions required noble birth and proven leadership. This meritocratic element within aristocratic structure motivated fierce competition. Weapons and tactics also developed. The macuawitl, the obsidian-edged sword, was perfected. Shield designs identified units and ranks. Cotton armor was improved to be lighter yet stronger. Battle tactics emphasized coordinated movements and psychological warfare. Drums, conch shells, and war cries created terrifying acoustic assault. Feathered standards and elaborate costumes added visual intimidation. The goal was often to break enemy morale before engagement. The role of women in the Triple Alliance deserves attention. While excluded from combat, they were essential to military success. They prepared food and supplies for campaigns. They maintained economic production while men were at war. They performed religious rituals to ensure victory. Some served as spies or negotiators. Noble women's marriages cemented political alliances. Their influence, though informal, shaped policy decisions. Itzcoatl ruled until 1440, transforming Tenochtitlan from tributary to empire's heart. His successor, Moctezuma Iluikamina, Moctezuma II, would expand the empire even further, but Itzcoatl laid the foundations. He created the Triple Alliance. He established military superiority. He reformed governmental structures. He validated Mexica divine destiny. Every subsequent ruler built upon his achievements. The psychological transformation was perhaps most significant. The Mexica no longer thought of themselves as refugees or newcomers. They were the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli. They were heirs to the Toltec legacy. They were destined to rule the world. This confidence, bordering on arrogance, would drive expansion for the next century. It would also blind them to certain threats, particularly from across the Eastern Sea. Moctezuma Iluisamina took power in 1440 as the 5th Huey Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. His name meant angry lord who pierces the sky with arrows. He had proven himself as a warrior under Itzcoatl. Now he would prove himself as an empire builder. His reign of 28 years would see the Triple Alliance transform from regional power to dominant empire. Under his leadership, the Aztecs would conquer territories from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific Ocean. The early years of Moctezuma I's reign faced natural disasters that tested his leadership. From 1450 to 1454, central Mexico suffered devastating droughts and frosts. Crops failed repeatedly, lakes dried up, people ate bark, roots, and leather to survive. Some sold themselves into slavery for food. Bodies littered the streets of Tenochtitlan. This catastrophe, remembered as the Year One Rabbit Famine, killed thousands and threatened the empire's stability. Moctezuma I responded with practical and spiritual measures. He opened royal granaries to feed the starving. He organized public works projects to provide employment. He negotiated with unconquered regions to trade future military service for immediate food supplies. He intensified religious ceremonies to appease the gods. When the rains finally returned, he credited divine intervention and declared massive sacrificial ceremonies in gratitude. The famine taught important lessons. Moctezuma I ordered the construction of additional storage facilities for surplus grain. He expanded the Chinampa system to increase agricultural production. He conquered regions with different climate zones to ensure diverse food sources. He established tribute requirements that included preserved foods. These preparations would prevent future famines from reaching such devastating levels. With the crisis past, Moctezuma I resumed expansion. His armies marched east toward the Gulf Coast. The Totonac cities fell one by one. These conquests brought access to tropical products like vanilla, rubber, and exotic feathers. Cotton plantations provided material for armor and clothing. Cacao groves supplied the beans used as currency and for the sacred chocolate drink. Coastal regions also provided shells which had religious significance. The southern campaigns pushed into Oaxaca and beyond. The Mixtec and Zapotec peoples had ancient civilizations with impressive cities. They resisted fiercely but ultimately succumbed to Aztec military might. These conquests brought gold, jade, and turquoise into the empire. Skilled Mixtec craftsmen were brought to Tenochtitlan to create luxury goods for the nobility. Their influence enriched Aztec artistic traditions. Moctezuma thus understood that conquest required more than military force. He established the tribute system that would characterize the Aztec Empire. Each conquered city-state retained its local ruler and customs. They were required to send specified tribute to Tenochtitlan at regular intervals. Tribute lists were recorded in detailed codices. Failure to pay resulted in military punishment. This system allowed the Aztecs to control vast territories with minimal direct administration. The Flower Wars, or Xochiaoyotl, were institutionalized during Moctezuma Khan's reign. These were ritualized conflicts with neighboring states, particularly Tlaxcala and Huexotzingo. The wars served multiple purposes. They provided captives for sacrifice. They trained warriors in real combat. They demonstrated Aztec military superiority. They maintained threatening pressure on unconquered enemies. These conflicts would continue until the Spanish conquest. Moctezuma also focused on Tenochtitlan's grandeur. He expanded the Great Temple, adding new levels to the pyramid. He built a new palace with hundreds of rooms, gardens, and a zoo containing animals from across the empire. He commissioned massive stone sculptures, including the famous sunstone that recorded Aztec cosmology. He established botanical gardens to study medicinal plants. His reign saw Tenochtitlan transform from impressive city to magnificent imperial capital. The legal system was codified and expanded under Moctezuma III. Courts were established at multiple levels. Local judges handled minor disputes. Regional courts addressed serious crimes. The Supreme Court in Tenochtitlan reviewed capital cases. Laws covered everything from property rights to dress codes. Punishments were harsh but consistent. Nobles faced stricter penalties than commoners for the same crimes, as they were expected to set examples. Education expanded dramatically during this period. Every Kalpuli was required to maintain schools. The curriculum included military training, crafts, history, and religious instruction. Talented students could advance regardless of birth status. The Kalmakak schools for nobility taught advanced subjects like astronomy, mathematics, law, and rhetoric. This educational system created literate administrators and skilled professionals necessary for running an empire. When Moctezuma died in 1469, the empire was unrecognizable from what he had inherited. The Triple Alliance controlled most of central Mexico. Tribute flowed from hundreds of cities. Tenochtitlan had grown to perhaps 100,000 inhabitants. The Aztec military was the most feared force in Mesoamerica. The infrastructure for continued expansion was firmly established. Axayacatl, grandson of Itzcoatl, became the sixth Huey Tlatoani in 1469. Young and ambitious, he sought to exceed his predecessor's achievements. His first major campaign targeted the Toluca Valley west of Tenochtitlan. This region was controlled by the Matlatzinca people, skilled warriors who fought with slings and clubs. The campaign was brutal, with high casualties on both sides. Victory brought the empire to the edges of Tarascan territory. The Tarascans, centered in modern Michoacán, were the Aztec Empire's most formidable enemy. They had developed sophisticated metallurgy, producing bronze weapons superior to obsidian. Their military organization rivaled the Aztecs. When Axayacatl invaded Tarascan territory in 1478, he suffered the empire's worst defeat. 20,000 Aztec warriors were killed or captured. Axayacatl himself was wounded and barely escaped. This defeat established a permanent frontier that the Aztecs never crossed. Despite this setback, Axayacatl achieved significant victories elsewhere. He conquered the valley of Toluca completely. He suppressed rebellions in Oaxaca. He extended control along the Gulf Coast. He even conquered Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's sister city, ending its independence. This last conquest was particularly significant, as it brought the great market of Tlatelolco under direct Tenochtitlan control. Axayacatl's reign saw cultural flowering alongside military campaigns. He commissioned the creation of the Aztec calendar stone, the massive sculpture that synthesized Aztec understanding of time and cosmology. He patronized poets and musicians. He established workshops for featherworkers and goldsmiths. He collected ancient manuscripts and artifacts. His court became a centre of learning and artistic production. The succession after Axayacattl's death in 1481 brought controversy. Tizoc, his brother, became the 7th Huey Tlatoani, but Tizoc proved a weak military leader. His coronation campaign, traditionally a demonstration of new rulers' prowess, was embarrassingly unsuccessful. He captured only 40 prisoners for sacrifice. Subsequent campaigns fared little better. Rebellions erupted in previously pacified territories. Tribute payments declined. The empire's momentum stalled. Tizoc compensated for military weakness with architectural projects. He expanded the Great Temple again, adding elaborate carved panels depicting Aztec victories. He built new administrative buildings. He improved Tenochtitlan's infrastructure. But these projects could not mask his fundamental failure as war leader. After 5 years of ineffective rule, Tizoc died under mysterious circumstances. Many historians suspect he was poisoned by nobles frustrated with his weakness. Ahuitzotl, another brother of Axayacatl, became the 8th Huey Tlatoani in 1486. He was everything Tizoc was not: aggressive, charismatic, and militarily brilliant. His coronation campaign captured over 7,000 prisoners. His dedication of the expanded Great Temple in 1487 involved the sacrifice of tens of thousands of captives over 4 days. Foreign dignitaries who witnessed this spectacle returned home with terrifying reports of Aztec power. Ahuitzotl's conquests exceeded all previous rulers. He pushed south into Guatemala. He reached both coasts from Veracruz to Acapulco. He conquered the Zapotec capital of Mitla. He subjugated the remote mountain peoples of Guerrero. Under his rule, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. Only the Tarascans in the west and Tlaxcalans in the east remained unconquered. The massive expansion created administrative challenges. Ahuitzotl established new governmental positions to manage distant provinces. He created a professional military class supported by tribute rather than farming. He built fortresses at strategic locations. He improved roads to speed communication and troop movements. He standardized weights and measures across the empire. These reforms created institutional capacity for managing continental-scale territory. Ahuitzotl also transformed Tenochtitlan into a true imperial capital. The population swelled to over 200,000. New aqueducts brought fresh water from multiple sources. The palace complex expanded to include specialized buildings for different governmental functions. The Great Temple reached its final height of 90 feet. Causeways were widened to accommodate increased traffic. The city's canals were deepened for larger cargo canoes. But Ahuitzotl's aggressive expansion created problems. Constant warfare exhausted the population. Heavy tribute demands sparked resentment. The need for sacrificial victims alienated potential allies. The empire was stretched thin, with rebellions requiring constant military suppression. When Ahuitzotl died in 1502, possibly from a head injury sustained during flooding, the empire was powerful but unstable. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma Sex, became the 9th Huey Tlatoani in 1502. Unlike his predecessors, who were primarily warriors, Moctezuma's II was a priest and philosopher. He had served as high priest before his election. His interests included astronomy, theology, and divination. This intellectual orientation would profoundly influence his response to later events. Moctezuma II's early reign continued imperial expansion. He conquered additional territories in Oaxaca and Veracruz. He suppressed rebellions with calculated brutality. He reorganized the tribute system for greater efficiency. He elevated imperial ceremony to new heights of elaboration. Court protocol became so complex that common people were forbidden to look directly at him. The nobility's privileges expanded under Moctezuma II. Only nobles could wear cotton clothing, gold jewelry, and Quetzal feathers. Only nobles could build 2-story houses. Only nobles could drink chocolate publicly. These restrictions created visible hierarchy, but also resentment among successful commoners and merchants. The gap between social classes widened dramatically. Moctezuma II was deeply religious, even by Aztec standards. He increased sacrificial ceremonies. He consulted omens obsessively. He supported priests generously. He built new temples throughout the empire. This religious focus would later paralyze him when confronting Spanish conquistadors who didn't fit traditional cosmic understanding. By 1519, the Aztec Empire under Moctezuma II appeared invincible. It controlled territory from ocean to ocean. Millions paid tribute to Tenochtitlan. The capital was the largest city in the Americas. The military seemed undefeatable. The gods appeared satisfied with constant sacrifice. Yet within 2 years, this mighty empire would collapse before a few hundred Spanish adventurers. The seeds of destruction were already present in the empire's structure. Dawn came early to Tenochtitlan. Before the sun painted the eastern mountains, conch shells sounded from the temple pyramids. The deep, mournful notes echoed across the lake, reaching every household in the city. People stirred on their reed mats. Mothers rekindled fires from carefully preserved embers. Fathers prepared for another day of labor. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Another day in the greatest city of the Americas had begun. The typical Mexica family lived in a single-room house built around a courtyard. Walls were made of adobe brick or volcanic stone, depending on the family's wealth. Roofs were flat, often used for drying crops or as additional living space. The courtyard was the center of domestic life. Here women ground corn on stone metates. Here children played with clay toys and miniature tools. Here families gathered for evening meals. Privacy was minimal. Multiple related families often shared a compound, with grandparents, parents, children, aunts, uncles, and cousins living in close proximity. The social hierarchy of Tenochtitlan was complex but clearly defined. At the apex stood the Huey Tlatoani, the supreme ruler who was considered semi-divine. Below him were the Tecuhtine, the highest nobles who governed provinces and led armies. The Pipiltin formed the broader nobility, serving as administrators, judges, and military officers. The Poshteka were long-distance merchants, wealthy but not noble. The Masi-Hultin were commoners, farmers, craftsmen, labourers, and soldiers. At the bottom were the Tlacotin, slaves who had lost freedom through debt, crime, or capture. But this hierarchy was not absolute. A commoner could rise through military achievement. Capturing 4 enemies in battle earned entry to the warrior societies. Exceptional service could result in land grants and noble privileges. Merchants could accumulate wealth rivaling nobles, though they had to display it carefully to avoid jealousy. Skilled craftsmen commanded respect and good wages. Even slaves had rights and could purchase freedom. This social mobility, limited but real, motivated ambition and achievement. The Kalpuli system organized urban life. Each Kalpuli was simultaneously a neighborhood, an administrative unit, and an extended kinship group. The Kalpuli owned land collectively, distributing plots to member families. It maintained its own temple, school, and administrative building. It organized labor for public works. It provided military companies in wartime. The Kalpuli leader, elected from noble families within the group, represented members in city government. This system balanced individual initiative with collective responsibility. Work began early for most Tenochtitlan residents. Farmers poled their canoes to chinampas before sunrise. They tended corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, and chili peppers. They cleared water channels of vegetation. They added fresh mud to maintain soil fertility. They harvested crops at peak ripeness. During planting and harvest, entire families worked together. Children scared away birds. Women prepared meals in the fields. The work was hard but productive. A single chinampa could feed a family with surplus for market. Craftsmen worked in specialized workshops. Feather workers created elaborate headdresses and cloaks, carefully attaching thousands of tropical bird feathers to cotton backing. Goldsmiths and silversmiths produced jewelry using lost wax casting techniques. Obsidian knappers created razor-sharp blades for tools and weapons. Potters shaped vessels for cooking, storage, and ceremony. Weavers produced cloth ranging from rough Megi fiber to fine cotton. Each craft had its patron deity and special ceremonies. The marketplace of Tlatelolco was the economic heart of the empire. Every 5 days, up to 60,000 people gathered to buy and sell. The market was carefully organized by product type. Vegetables here, pottery there, textiles in another section. Market judges resolved disputes and punished cheating. Prices were set by negotiation, using cacao beans, copper axes, or quills filled with gold dust as currency. The variety was staggering. Everything from basic foodstuffs to exotic luxuries from distant provinces. Women's daily lives centered on domestic duties but extended beyond them. They woke before dawn to grind corn for the day's tortillas, a process taking hours of hard physical labor. They prepared meals, maintaining the hearth fire that symbolized family continuity. They spun thread and wove cloth, creating textiles for family use and sale. They raised children, teaching daughters domestic skills and proper behavior. They tended household gardens and small animals. They participated in religious ceremonies. Some worked as merchants, midwives, healers, or priestesses. Children's lives were structured from birth. Babies were bathed immediately after birth and presented to the gods. Boys received tiny shields and arrows. Girls received miniature weaving tools. These gifts symbolized their future roles. By age 3, children performed simple tasks. Boys carried water and collected firewood. Girls learned to spin thread. By 7, boys attended school. Education was compulsory, though quality varied by social class. The Tenochtitlan schools educated commoner boys. The curriculum emphasized military training. Boys learned to use weapons, march in formation, and follow commands. They also learned crafts, agriculture, and civic duties. Discipline was harsh. Lazy students were beaten with sticks or pricked with cactus thorns. But successful students could advance to warrior status, improving their social position. The Karmakak schools served noble boys and exceptional commoners. The curriculum was broader and more demanding. Students learned reading and writing in the pictographic system. They studied history, law, and rhetoric. They memorized religious texts and calendar calculations. They learned medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. They practiced bloodletting and fasting for religious ceremonies. Graduates became priests, judges, administrators, or military commanders. Girls' education happened primarily at home, though some attended temple schools. They learned cooking, weaving, and household management. They memorized songs and prayers. They practiced the modest behavior expected of women. Noble girls received more elaborate training in etiquette, conversation, and artistic skills. Some exceptional women became priestesses or healers, requiring specialized education. Marriage customs reflected social values and practical needs. Most people married in their late teens or early 20s. Parents arranged marriages, consulting fortune tellers about compatibility. The groom's family offered gifts to the bride's family. The ceremony involved tying the couple's garments together. Feasting followed, with elaborate speeches about marital duties. Divorce was possible but discouraged. Men could have multiple wives if they could support them. Women could own property and conduct business independently. Food preparation and consumption followed established patterns. The morning meal was simple, atole, corn porridge flavored with chili or honey. The main meal came in early afternoon. Tortillas were the staple, eaten with beans, vegetables, and occasionally meat. Tamales appeared at festivals. The wealthy enjoyed greater variety: turkey, dog, fish, and countless vegetables and fruits. Chocolate, prepared as a bitter, frothy drink, was reserved for nobility and special occasions. Clothing indicated status, occupation, and achievement. Common men wore a loincloth and cloak, both of rough McGee fibre. Successful warriors earned the right to wear cotton and specific designs. Nobles dressed in fine cotton with elaborate decoration. Priests wore black, often splattered with sacrificial blood. Women's clothing was more uniform, skirt and blouse, but quality and decoration varied by status. Jewelry, feathers, and face paint added individual expression within social constraints. Housing varied dramatically by social class. Commoners lived in simple 1- or 2-room structures. Walls were adobe or wattle and daub. Floors were packed earth. Furniture was minimal. Reed mats for sleeping, low tables, storage jars. Noble houses were elaborate complexes with multiple rooms around courtyards. Walls were plastered and painted. Floors were covered with mats or animal skins. Gardens provided beauty and fresh air. The emperor's palace contained hundreds of rooms, including reception halls, administrative offices, workshops, arsenals, and private apartments. Hygiene and health practices were sophisticated. People bathed frequently in the lake or in steam baths. They used soap from the Quetzalcoatl tree. They cleaned their teeth with salt and charcoal. Human waste was collected for fertilizer, keeping streets relatively clean. Healers treated illness with extensive pharmacopoeia of herbal remedies. They could set bones, stitch wounds, and perform dental work. They understood the importance of quarantine for contagious diseases. Entertainment and leisure existed despite hard lives. People played Patoli, a board game combining strategy and chance. They watched Tlachtli, the ball game where rubber balls were hit through stone rings using only hips and elbows. This game had religious significance, representing cosmic struggles between light and darkness. Sometimes players wagered everything they owned on outcomes. Professional players commanded respect similar to warriors. Music filled the streets and plazas. Drums beat complex rhythms. Flutes played haunting melodies. Rattles and bells added texture. Every ceremony, market day, and festival featured musicians. Professional entertainers included acrobats, jugglers, and jesters who performed at noble feasts. Storytellers recounted myths and histories in market squares. Poetry recitations drew educated audiences. The Aztecs valued eloquent speech, calling it flowers and songs that enriched life. Festivals punctuated the calendar year. Each month brought specific celebrations honoring different deities. These weren't simple religious observances, but community events combining worship, entertainment, and social bonding. People danced in elaborate costumes. They feasted on special foods. They watched mock battles and theatrical performances. They participated in processions through the city. During Toxcatl, a young man impersonated Tezcatlipoca for a year, living in luxury before his sacrifice. During Oxpanistli, women danced with brooms to honor the earth goddess. The concept of time shaped daily routines. The Aztecs tracked multiple calendar systems simultaneously. The Tonalpohualli, the 260-day ritual calendar, determined lucky and unlucky days for specific activities. The Xiuhpohualli, the 365-day solar calendar, governed agricultural and civic activities. Every 52 years, when both calendars aligned, the new fire ceremony renewed cosmic order. People understood their lives within these temporal frameworks, planning activities according to auspicious timing. Death was ever present in Tenochtitlan. Infant mortality was high. Disease, accident, and sacrifice claimed lives regularly. But death wasn't feared as ending. The Aztecs believed in multiple afterlife destinations based on manner of death. Warriors who died in battle became hummingbirds accompanying the sun. Women who died in childbirth became divine beings guiding the sun through the underworld. Drowning victims went to Tlaloc's paradise. Most people journeyed through Mictlan's 9 levels, facing challenges for 4 years before reaching final rest. Funeral practices reflected these beliefs. Bodies were usually cremated, though some were buried. Grave goods accompanied the deceased: tools, food, clothing, and a dog to guide them through the underworld. Nobles received elaborate funerals with sacrifice servants to attend them in death. Families observed mourning periods with specific restrictions on bathing, eating, and celebration. Annual ceremonies honored deceased ancestors, maintaining connections between living and dead. The elderly held special status in Aztec society. Age brought wisdom and respect. Grandparents helped raise children while parents worked. Elder men served as advisors in Kalpuli councils. Elder women worked as matchmakers and midwives. The elderly could drink pulque freely, a privilege restricted for younger people. They were exempt from certain taxes and labor obligations. Their memories preserved historical knowledge in a largely oral culture. Slavery in Tenochtitlan differed from many other societies. Slaves weren't racially distinct or permanently degraded. People became slaves through debt, criminal punishment, or voluntary self-sale during hardship. War captives were usually sacrificed rather than enslaved. Slaves could own property, marry free people, and buy their freedom. Children of slaves were born free. Slaves who escaped to the ruler's palace during market days gained freedom. This system provided labor while maintaining social flexibility. The Pochteca merchants occupied a unique social position. They weren't noble but commanded wealth and influence. They organized trading expeditions to distant lands, journeys lasting months or years. They served as spies, gathering intelligence about foreign territories. They had their own laws, courts, and patron deity. They could own land and slaves, but they had to display wealth carefully. Too much ostentation invited noble jealousy. They wore simple clothing in Tenochtitlan but dressed elaborately abroad. Professional warriors formed a distinct class. The eagle and jaguar warriors were elite societies requiring specific battlefield achievements for entry. Eagle warriors wore feathered costumes mimicking their patron bird. Jaguar warriors dressed in spotted skins. Both groups received land grants, tax exemptions, and the right to dine in the royal palace. They served as imperial guards and led military campaigns. Their children could attend Kalmakak schools. Military service offered the clearest path for social advancement. Priests formed another specialized group. They weren't a separate caste, but individuals dedicated to religious service. Some served temporarily, fulfilling vows or seeking divine favor. Others committed their lives to temple service. Priests maintained ritual calendars, performed sacrifices, interpreted omens, and educated noble youth. They practiced severe austerities, fasting, bloodletting, and celibacy. Their hair grew long and matted with blood. They dressed in black robes. They commanded fear and respect as intermediaries between human and divine realms. The legal system affected everyone's daily life. Laws covered personal behavior, commercial transactions, and social obligations. Theft, adultery, and drunkenness brought severe punishments. Public intoxication was punishable by death for young people, but permitted for the elderly. Moving boundary stones between properties was a capital crime. Judges were held to high standards. A judge who accepted bribes faced execution. The legal system emphasized restitution over incarceration. Prisons held people awaiting trial, not serving sentences. Tax and tribute obligations structured economic life. Commoners paid taxes through labor on public works and military service. They contributed to temple maintenance and religious ceremonies. Nobles were exempt from most taxes but had military and administrative obligations. Conquered cities paid tribute in goods and services. Detailed tribute lists specified exact quantities and qualities required. Failure to meet tribute obligations brought military punishment. This system funded government operations and redistributed wealth throughout the empire. Gender roles were clearly defined but not absolutely rigid. Men dominated public life, government, military, and priesthood. Women controlled domestic spheres and influenced public matters indirectly. But women could own property, run businesses, and serve as priestesses or healers. Prostitution was legal and regulated. Some women achieved significant wealth and influence. The goddess tradition provided female divine models. Gender complementarity rather than strict hierarchy characterized many social relationships. The Aztec universe pulsed with divine energy. Every mountain contained a god. Every stream hosted spirits. The wind carried messages between worlds. The earth itself was a massive crocodile floating in primordial waters. Above stretched 13 heavens, each with its own deity and purpose. Below yawned 9 underworld levels, dark and challenging. Humans occupied the thin space between, maintaining cosmic balance through ritual and sacrifice. At the heart of Aztec religion stood the concept of Teotl, divine force that animated everything. Teotl was not a single god, but the sacred energy flowing through all existence. It could concentrate in specific places, objects, or beings. Mountains, especially volcanoes, contained powerful Teotl. Certain trees, stones, and springs possessed it. Rulers and priests could channel it. This force was neither good nor evil, but simply powerful, requiring careful management through ritual. The Aztec pantheon included hundreds of deities, each with specific roles and attributes. These gods were not separate beings, but different manifestations of Teotl. They could merge, split, and transform. A single deity might have multiple aspects with different names. This fluid theology confused Spanish chroniclers but made perfect sense within Aztec thought. Divine reality was complex, multifaceted, and constantly changing. Huitzilopochtli remained the Mexica's patron, the god who had guided them from Aztlan to Tenochtitlan. Born fully grown for battle, he represented the sun at its zenith and the warrior ideal. Each dawn he battled the forces of darkness to bring light to the world. Each sunset he descended to the underworld to fight through the night. Human sacrifice provided him strength for these cosmic battles. Without blood offerings, the sun would fail to rise, ending the world. Tlaloc, the rain god, was ancient, predating the Aztecs by centuries. He controlled precipitation, from gentle showers to devastating floods. His paradise, Tlalocan, was a garden of eternal spring, where those who drowned or died from water-related causes spent eternity. He demanded child sacrifices, particularly during droughts. The children's tears were considered especially pleasing as they mimicked rain. This practice horrified Spanish observers but seemed logical within Aztec cosmology. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, embodied wind, learning, and creation. In some stories, he created humanity by stealing bones from the underworld and mixing them with his own blood. He invented the calendar, writing, and many arts. He opposed human sacrifice, preferring offerings of flowers, incense, and butterflies. His conflict with Tezcatlipoca drove many mythological narratives. Some traditions predicted his return from the east, a prophecy that would have fatal consequences when Cortés arrived. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, was Quetzalcoatl's eternal rival. He represented conflict, change, and royal power. His missing foot, lost to the earth monster during creation, symbolized incompleteness driving cosmic dynamism. He could see everything through his obsidian mirror. He tested humans with temptation and adversity. Warriors prayed to him before battle. Rulers sought his favor through bloodletting. His priests wore his image during certain ceremonies, becoming the god incarnate. The earth goddess had multiple aspects, each terrifying and essential. As Coatlicue, serpent skirt, she was mother of gods and monsters. As Tlaloc, she was the earth monster demanding blood to produce vegetation. As Cihuacuatl, she was the divine midwife who helped create humanity. These aspects weren't separate goddesses, but different faces of Earth's power. She gave life and demanded death in return, embodying the reciprocal relationship between humans and Earth. Creation mythology explained the world's structure and humanity's obligations. The current world was the fifth sun, the previous four having been destroyed by jaguars, wind, fire, and flood. This fifth sun would end in earthquakes. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create this world and set the sun in motion. Humans owed endless debt for this divine sacrifice. Blood offerings were partial payment on this cosmic debt, maintaining universal order. The Aztec calendar system integrated solar observations with religious meaning. The 365-day solar calendar tracked seasons and agricultural cycles. The 260-day ritual calendar determined ceremonial timing and personal destiny. These calendars meshed like gears, creating a 52-year cycle. Each day had patron deities and specific qualities. Children born on certain days were destined for particular fates. Activities begun on appropriate days were more likely to succeed. Temples were cosmic mountains connecting earth to heavens. The great temple of Tenochtitlan represented Coatepec, where Huitzilopochtli was born. Its twin shrines honored Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, war and agriculture, the empire's foundations. Climbing the temple's steps recreated mythological journeys. The summit was a threshold between worlds where priests could communicate with gods. Blood flowing down the steps fed the earth, completing the cosmic circuit. Priests formed a complex hierarchy managing religious life. The Quetzalcoatl Totec Tlamocaski served as high priest of the entire empire. Below him, the Quetzalcoatl Tlaloc Tlamocaski supervised Tlaloc's cult. Hundreds of lower-ranking priests maintained specific temples and ceremonies. Priestesses served certain goddesses, particularly those associated with earth and fertility. Priests underwent rigorous training in theology, astronomy, and ritual practice. They lived austere lives of fasting, bloodletting, and celibacy. Sacrifice was the fundamental religious act, recreating divine sacrifices that created the world. The Aztecs practiced many forms of sacrifice. Bloodletting from one's own body was most common. People pierced their tongues, earlobes, and genitals with cactus spines or stingray barbs. The blood was collected on paper and burned, carrying its essence to gods. This personal sacrifice demonstrated piety and sought divine favor. Animal sacrifice included quail, dogs, turkeys, and butterflies. Each creature had symbolic significance. Quail represented warriors, Dogs guided souls through the underworld. Turkeys were associated with nobility. Butterflies symbolized transformation and souls. These sacrifices occurred daily in temples and homes. The meat was usually eaten after the offering, sharing divine sustenance with worshippers. Human sacrifice, though most famous, was relatively rare compared to other forms. Victims were usually war captives, though slaves and volunteers also died on altars. The method varied by ceremony. Heart extraction was most common, accomplished with obsidian knives. Decapitation, drowning, burning, and arrow sacrifice served specific ritual purposes. Victims were often treated well before death, sometimes impersonating gods for months or years before sacrifice. The meaning of human sacrifice extended beyond simple bloodthirst. Aztecs believed the universe required constant renewal through sacrifice. The sun needed blood to continue its journey. The earth needed blood to produce crops. The gods needed blood to maintain their strength. Sacrifice was cosmic maintenance preventing universal collapse. Warriors who captured victims for sacrifice were performing religious duty, not just military service. Cannibalism followed certain sacrifices, though its extent remains debated. The victim's flesh was considered sacred, infused with divine essence. Consumption was ritualized, not nutritional. Only specific people could eat certain parts. The heart usually went to the sun. The blood fed the earth. The head was displayed on skull racks. The limbs might be distributed to the captor's family. This practice horrified Europeans but represented communion with divinity for Aztecs. Festivals punctuated the religious calendar. Each month brought specific celebrations. Alacahualo honored Tlaloc with child sacrifice. Toxcatl celebrated Tezcatlipoca with the sacrifice of his impersonator. Oxpenistli honored the earth goddess with harvest ceremonies. These festivals involved entire communities. People danced, sang, feasted, and participated in processions. The boundaries between sacred and secular, serious and celebratory, dissolved during these events. Personal religious practice shaped daily life. Individuals maintained household shrines with deity images. They offered incense, flowers, and food daily. They observed fasting periods and behavioral restrictions. They consulted calendar priests about auspicious timing. They participated in neighborhood ceremonies. They made pilgrimages to specific temples. Religion was not separate from daily life, but integrated into every activity. Divination and omens guided decision-making. Priests interpreted dreams, unusual animal behavior, and celestial phenomena. The calls of certain birds predicted future events. Comets and eclipses warned of disasters. The calendar determined favorable days for activities. Rulers consulted omens before military campaigns. Merchants checked signs before trading expeditions. Parents considered portents when naming children. This constant attention to divine communication maintained connection between human and sacred realms. The concept of sin differed from European Christianity. Aztecs believed misconduct disrupted cosmic balance rather than offending personal deity. Sexual transgressions, drunkenness, and violence created spiritual pollution. This contamination could spread to family and community. Confession to Tlazolteotl, goddess of filth and purification, cleansed spiritual pollution. But confession could only happen once in a lifetime, so most people waited until old age. Death and afterlife beliefs shaped attitudes toward mortality. Destination after death depended on manner of dying, not moral behavior. Warriors and sacrificial victims joined the sun's journey. Women who died in childbirth became divine warriors. Drowning victims entered Tlaloc's paradise. Most people traveled to Mictlan, facing 9 levels of challenges. The journey took 4 years, aided by possessions buried with the deceased. This understanding removed some death anxiety while emphasizing the importance of dying appropriately. The morning sun struck the summit of the great temple, setting the painted stucco ablaze with color. Red, blue, yellow, and white geometric patterns covered every surface. Stone serpents writhed along the balustrades. Massive braziers sent smoke spiraling into the sky. This was architecture as cosmic statement, engineering as religious expression, art as divine communication. The Aztecs built not just for human purposes, but to maintain universal order through stone and paint. Aztec architecture began with cosmic principles. Buildings oriented to cardinal directions. Pyramids replicated sacred mountains. Plazas represented the Earth's surface. Ball courts embodied the underworld's challenges. Every structure had religious significance beyond practical function. The city itself was a massive theological statement, with the great temple at its center marking the universe's axis. Streets and canals radiating outward created a cosmic map in urban form. The Great Temple, or Templo Mayor, epitomized Aztec architectural achievement. It rose in 7 stages to a height of 90 feet. Twin staircases ascended the western face, leading to 2 shrines. The northern shrine, painted blue and white, honored Tlaloc. The southern shrine, painted red and black, honored Huitzilopochtli. Each construction phase incorporated the previous structure, creating nested pyramids representing accumulated history and growing power. Construction techniques combined practical engineering with ritual significance. Workers began by creating a solid core of earth and rubble. They faced this with cut stone, usually volcanic tozontal. They covered the stone with thick stucco made from lime and sand. They painted the stucco with mineral pigments that retained brilliance for decades. Each construction phase required ceremonies, sacrifices, and careful astronomical timing. Building was a sacred act requiring divine approval. Palace architecture demonstrated wealth and sophistication. Moctezuma Seku's palace covered nearly 10 acres. It contained hundreds of rooms arranged around courtyards. Reception halls could accommodate thousands. Private apartments provided luxury and privacy. Specialized rooms housed archives, arsenals, and workshops. Gardens included both decorative and medicinal plants. Aviaries contained birds from across the empire. Zoos displayed jaguars, eagles, and serpents. The palace was a miniature cosmos under royal control. Sculpture served religious and political purposes. Monumental stone carvings decorated temples and public spaces. The sunstone, weighing 24 tons, synthesized Aztec cosmology in intricate relief. The Coyolxauhqui stone depicted the dismembered goddess at the great temple's base. Colossal heads of gods and rulers demonstrated divine authority. These sculptures required armies of workers to carve, transport, and position. They were painted in brilliant colors, though only traces remain today. Smaller sculptures showed equal skill. Obsidian masks captured individual features with startling realism. Jade figurines demonstrated understanding of human anatomy. Animal sculptures revealed careful natural observation. These pieces served as temple offerings, burial goods, and royal gifts. The finest examples combined multiple materials: turquoise mosaic on wood, gold inlay on stone, shell and obsidian creating contrasting colors. Aztec painting survived primarily in codices, though murals once covered temple and palace walls. The painting style was conceptual rather than realistic. Figures appeared in profile with standardized proportions. Colors were flat and symbolic rather than naturalistic. Size indicated importance rather than perspective. Multiple viewpoints could appear in single scenes. This style efficiently communicated complex information about history, religion, and tribute obligations. Codices were books painted on bark paper or deerskin. They folded accordion style, allowing sequential reading. Professional scribes called tlaquilloque created these manuscripts. They recorded historical events, genealogies, tribute lists, and religious knowledge. The combination of pictographic and ideographic elements could convey sophisticated concepts. Reading required extensive training, as symbols had multiple meanings depending on context. Featherwork represented the height of Aztec artistic achievement. A manteca, specialized featherworkers, created stunning mosaics using thousands of tropical bird feathers. They attached feathers to cotton backing with plant-based adhesives. They achieved subtle color gradations and three-dimensional effects. Feathered shields, headdresses, and cloaks were more valuable than gold. The few surviving examples, despite centuries of deterioration, still dazzle with their brilliance and technical mastery. Metallurgy arrived late in central Mexico but developed quickly. Aztec goldsmiths learned techniques from conquered regions. They mastered lost wax casting, creating hollow figurines with delicate details. They could alloy gold with silver and copper to achieve different colors. They understood how to work metal through heating and hammering. They created jewelry, ritual objects, and decorative items. Most Aztec goldwork was melted by conquistadors, making surviving pieces especially precious. Pottery ranged from utilitarian to highly decorative. Common vessels were unglazed earthenware, functional but well-made. Elite ceramics featured painted designs, often depicting gods or mythological scenes. Specialized vessels served ritual purposes. Incense burners took elaborate forms. Funerary urns contained cremated remains. Musical instruments included ceramic flutes, ocarinas, and drums. The pottery tradition continued after conquest, preserving techniques and designs. Textiles demonstrated technical skill and artistic vision. Cotton and maggie fibers were spun into thread using hand spindles. Backstrap looms produced cloth up to 13 feet long. Natural dyes created rich colors: red from cochineal insects, blue from indigo plants, purple from sea snails. Designs range from simple stripes to complex patterns. The finest textiles incorporated feathers, rabbit fur, and gold thread. Clothing communicated status, achievement, and identity through material, color, and design. Music was considered divine communication. Instruments included drums of various sizes, flutes, whistles, rattles, and bells. Conch shells served as horns. Songs accompanied every ceremony and celebration. Professional musicians trained from childhood. They memorized vast repertoires of ritual music. Notation didn't exist, so transmission was oral. The Spanish destroyed most indigenous instruments and banned many songs, causing irreparable cultural loss. Dance integrated movement, costume, and meaning. Each ceremony had specific dances. Movements could be slow and stately or wild and ecstatic. Dancers wore elaborate costumes representing gods, animals, or cosmic forces. Group coordination demonstrated social harmony. Solo performances by deity impersonators created divine presence. Dance was prayer in motion, theology in movement, community in synchronized action. Poetry and oratory were highest verbal arts. Aztec poetry used parallel structures, metaphors, and rhythmic repetition. Standard phrases like flowers and songs carried deep meaning. Poetry addressed themes of mortality, divinity, war, and love. Rulers and nobles competed in poetry contests. Elaborate speeches marked important occasions. Parents advised children through traditional orations. This rich oral literature was partially preserved through post-conquest transcription. Scientific achievements reflected careful observation and practical application. Aztec astronomers tracked celestial movements with remarkable accuracy. They predicted eclipses and planetary positions. They understood the solar year's length within minutes. They recognized Venus's cycle and its astronomical significance. Observations were made with simple instruments but careful methodology. This knowledge informed calendar creation, agricultural timing, and ritual scheduling. Mathematics used a vigesimal, base 20 system. Numbers were represented by dots, ones, bars, fives, and special symbols for 20 and powers of 20. They understood zero as placeholder and concept. They could perform complex calculations for engineering, commerce, and astronomy. Mathematical knowledge was essential for tribute collection, architectural planning, and calendar computation. Medicine combined empirical knowledge with spiritual healing. Aztec physicians called Tenochtitlan understood human anatomy from sacrifice observations. They could set bones, stitch wounds, and perform dental extractions. They used hundreds of medicinal plants, many proving effective in modern analysis. They understood contagion and quarantine principles. They performed successful surgeries including caesarean sections. Medical practice included both physical treatment and spiritual cleansing. Agricultural innovations supported dense populations. Chinampas maximized production in lake environments. Terracing allowed cultivation of steep slopes. Irrigation systems distributed water efficiently. Crop rotation maintained soil fertility. Selective breeding improved corn yields. Food preservation techniques including drying, salting, and fermentation prevented famine. These agricultural achievements enabled urban civilization in challenging environments. Urban planning demonstrated sophisticated understanding of infrastructure needs. Tenochtitlan's grid layout facilitated movement and administration. Canals and streets were carefully planned for efficiency. Aqueducts brought fresh water from distant springs. Dikes controlled lake levels and prevented flooding. Public buildings were strategically located for access. Markets were positioned for convenient distribution. Waste management systems maintained sanitation. This planning created one of the world's most functional pre-industrial cities. Strange omens began 8 years before the strangers arrived. A comet blazed across the night sky, its tail pointing toward the east like an accusatory finger. The temple of Huitzilopochtli burst into flames without apparent cause, and water could not extinguish it. Lake Texcoco boiled on a windless day, flooding houses along the shore. A woman's voice wailed through the night streets, crying for her children and prophesying doom. Moctezuma II observed these portents with growing dread. The cosmic order was disturbing itself, preparing for something unprecedented. In 1517, Francisco Hernández de Córdoba's expedition reached the Yucatan coast. The Maya who encountered these strangers sent word through trade networks. Stories reached Tenochtitlan of pale men with hair like the sun, riding creatures resembling deer but larger and more powerful. They carried sticks that produced thunder and lightning. They wore metal that could not be pierced by obsidian blades. Their massive houses floated on water. These descriptions matched no known people. Moctezuma's advisors debated whether these beings were human or divine. The following year, Juan de Grijalva explored the Gulf Coast. His expedition traded with coastal peoples, exchanging glass beads for gold. Word of these encounters reached Moctezuma more quickly. The strangers seemed interested primarily in gold, which the Aztecs valued but did not consider as precious as jade or feathers. They had interpreters who spoke Maya languages. They planted crosses and performed incomprehensible ceremonies. They gave gifts but also took what they wanted. Their intentions remained mysterious. Moctezuma sent artists to the coast to observe and record these strangers. The drawings they produced showed bearded men in strange clothing, ships with white wings, horses with riders merged as single beings, and dogs larger than any in Mexico. These images were studied intensely in Tenochtitlan. Priests consulted ancient texts for prophecies. Some suggested these might be representatives of Quetzalcoatl, returning from the east as legends foretold. Others argued they were simply foreign traders or pirates. On Good Friday, April 27, 1519, Hernán Cortés landed at Veracruz with approximately 600 men, 16 horses, and 10 bronze cannons. Unlike previous expeditions, Cortés intended conquest, not mere exploration. He had studied reports from earlier voyages. He understood that a great empire existed inland. He recognized the political tensions he could exploit. Most importantly, he possessed ambition unlimited by legal or moral constraints. Cortés immediately demonstrated military superiority and political cunning. He defeated local Totonac forces, then allied with them against their Aztec overlords. He founded Villarica de la Veracruz, creating legal justification for his actions. He burned his ships, preventing retreat and ensuring his men's commitment. He gathered intelligence about the Aztec Empire's structure, wealth, and vulnerabilities. Every action was calculated for maximum psychological and strategic impact. The Totonacs provided crucial information about Aztec tribute demands and the resentment they generated. They described Tenochtitlan's wealth in terms that inflamed Spanish greed. They explained the religious practices, especially human sacrifice, that would justify conquest in Spanish minds. They offered guides, porters, and provisions. Without Totonac assistance, Cortés's expedition would have failed before reaching the mountains. Moctezuma's response revealed paralysis between political pragmatism and religious uncertainty. He sent ambassadors with magnificent gifts, gold discs representing the sun, silver discs representing the moon, elaborate featherwork and precious stones. These gifts aimed to demonstrate power while encouraging the strangers to leave. Instead, they confirmed Spanish suspicions of vast wealth and intensified their determination to reach Tenochtitlan. The ambassadors performed ceremonies to determine if Cortés was Quetzalcoatl. They dressed him in the god's ceremonial attire. They offered him blood in a golden cup. They watched for divine signs. Cortés, though uncomprehending, played along with these rituals. His pale skin, arrival from the east, and timing near Quetzalcoatl's prophesied return year created troubling coincidences. Moctezuma's uncertainty about the stranger's nature would prove fatal. Marina, known as La Malinche, became Cortés's invaluable translator and advisor. Born to noble Nahuatl parents, sold into slavery and given to Cortés by the Maya, she spoke both Nahuatl and Maya languages. She quickly learned Spanish. More than a translator, she understood indigenous politics and psychology. She helped Cortés navigate cultural complexities. She became his mistress and bore his son. Her role was so significant that indigenous peoples called Cortés Malinche's captain. The Spanish march inland began in August 1519. The route from the coast to Tenochtitlan covered 250 miles through challenging terrain. They climbed from tropical lowlands through mountain passes reaching 13,000 feet. The journey that took Aztec runners 3 days required 3 months for the Spanish expedition. Along the way they encountered cities that revealed the empire's sophistication and wealth. Tlaxcala provided the crucial turning point. This independent state had resisted Aztec conquest for generations, maintaining independence through constant warfare. When Cortés arrived, the Tlaxcalans initially fought fiercely, but after several battles demonstrating Spanish military advantages, Tlaxcalan leaders made a strategic decision. They would ally with these strangers against their ancient enemies. This alliance provided Cortés with thousands of indigenous warriors, without whom conquest would have been impossible. The massacre at Cholula demonstrated Spanish ruthlessness and created terror that preceded them. Cortés, claiming to have discovered a plot, ordered an attack on unarmed nobles and citizens gathered in the temple courtyard. Thousands died. The city, sacred to Quetzalcoatl, was partially burned. This atrocity served multiple purposes. It eliminated a potential threat. It demonstrated Spanish willingness to use extreme violence. It showed indigenous allies that Spanish protection required absolute loyalty. It sent a message to Moctezuma that resistance would bring destruction. Spanish military advantages were significant but not overwhelming. Horses provided mobility and psychological impact. Steel swords and armor offered protection against obsidian weapons. Cannons and firearms created noise and smoke that terrified opponents. But Spanish forces were tiny compared to indigenous armies. Horses were few and vulnerable. Gunpowder was limited. Disease, particularly smallpox, would prove more decisive than military technology. Indigenous political structures inadvertently aided conquest. The Aztec Empire was a tributary system, not a unified state. Many subject peoples resented Aztec domination. They saw the Spanish as potential liberators rather than conquerors. They provided warriors, supplies, and intelligence. They didn't understand that Spanish conquest would prove worse than Aztec rule. This miscalculation enabled a few hundred Spaniards to overthrow an empire of millions. The psychological impact of Spanish arrival cannot be overstated. Nothing in Aztec experience prepared them for these invaders. Horses were monsters from mythology. Cannons were portable thunder. Steel was impervious to traditional weapons. Ships were floating mountains. Writing captured speech permanently. Christianity claimed exclusive truth. Every Spanish attribute challenged indigenous understanding of reality's nature. Religious differences created unbridgeable chasms. Spanish Christianity was monotheistic, exclusive, and evangelistic. Aztec polytheism was inclusive, flexible, and localized. Spaniards saw indigenous gods as demons requiring destruction. Aztecs initially tried incorporating Christian God into their pantheon. Spaniards demanded complete conversion. Aztecs couldn't comprehend religious exclusivity. These theological conflicts made peaceful coexistence impossible. Disease accompanied the Spanish like an invisible army. Smallpox, unknown in the Americas, spread through populations without immunity. Entire villages died within weeks. Traditional medicine had no effect. The disease killed indiscriminately. Nobles and commoners, warriors and priests, adults and children. Indigenous peoples interpreted this plague as divine punishment or sorcery. The psychological impact matched the demographic devastation. Communication barriers extended beyond language. Spaniards and Aztecs had fundamentally different worldviews. Concepts like private property, exclusive religion, and racial hierarchy didn't translate. Actions had different meanings in each culture. Gift-giving meant submission to Spaniards but relationship-building to Aztecs. Human sacrifice horrified Spaniards but seemed necessary to Aztecs. These misunderstandings accumulated into inevitable conflict. November 8, 1519. The causeway stretched before them across Lake Texcoco's shimmering waters. Cortés and his men, accompanied by thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors, approached the greatest city any of them had ever seen. Tenochtitlan rose from the lake like a vision, its white buildings and towering temples reflecting the afternoon sun. Crowds lined the causeway, silent and watchful. Then Moctezuma appeared, carried on a golden litter surrounded by nobles who swept the ground before his feet. The two worlds met on that narrow strip of earth between water and sky. Moctezuma descended from his litter. He wore a headdress of quetzal feathers that cascaded down his back. Gold and jade adorned his clothes. Turquoise decorated his sandals. He approached Cortés with deliberate dignity. Through Marina's translation, he welcomed the strangers to Tenochtitlan. Some accounts claim he acknowledged Cortés as Quetzalcoatl's representative. Others suggest this was Spanish fabrication. Whatever was truly said, Moctezuma's decision to welcome rather than resist the Spaniards sealed his empire's fate. The Spanish entered Tenochtitlan as guests, quartered in the palace of Axayacatl, Moctezuma's deceased father. They marvelled at the city's size and organization. The markets surpassed anything in Europe. The temples dwarfed Spanish churches. The palaces contained wonders beyond imagination. Gardens floated on the lake. Aqueducts brought fresh water from distant mountains. Streets were swept cleaner than any in Spain. Cortés wrote to Charles V that no European monarch possessed such a capital. But wonder quickly turned to calculation. Cortés recognized his precarious position. His few hundred Spaniards were surrounded by hundreds of thousands of potential enemies. The causeways could be easily cut, trapping them on the island. Food and water depended on Aztec goodwill. One signal from Moctezuma could bring overwhelming force against them. Cortés decided on a desperate gamble that would either secure Spanish position or destroy them entirely. 6 days after entering Tenochtitlan, Cortés took Moctezuma prisoner in his own capital. Using the pretext of an attack on Spaniards at the coast, Cortés demanded Moctezuma relocate to the Spanish quarters. Surrounded by armed conquistadors, Moctezuma had little choice. He maintained the fiction of voluntary relocation, continuing to rule from captivity. This unprecedented situation, an emperor imprisoned by his guests, paralyzed Aztec response. Traditional protocols offered no guidance for such circumstances. For months this strange arrangement continued. Moctezuma governed from Spanish quarters, issuing orders that were obeyed. He performed religious ceremonies. He received tribute. He adjudicated disputes. But Spanish soldiers accompanied him everywhere. Cortés demanded gold, and Moctezuma provided it. Temples were cleansed of blood and Christian images installed. Human sacrifice was forbidden. The Aztec nobility watched their divine ruler reduced to a puppet, their resentment growing daily. The treasury of Axayacatl was opened, revealing accumulated wealth from generations of conquest. Gold discs, jade masks, feathered shields, and precious stones filled room after room. The Spanish melted down artistic masterpieces into portable ingots. They destroyed irreplaceable cultural artifacts for their metallic value. Moctezuma watched this desecration in silence. Perhaps he hoped compliance would satisfy Spanish greed. Perhaps he still believed they were divine beings who would eventually depart. Perhaps he was simply buying time. In April 1520, disturbing news arrived. Pánfilo de Narváez had landed at Veracruz with 900 men, sent by Cuba's governor to arrest Cortés for exceeding his authority. Cortés faced an impossible choice. If he remained in Tenochtitlan, Narváez would arrest him. If he left, the tiny Spanish garrison might be overwhelmed. Cortés chose to march to the coast with most of his men, leaving Pedro de Alvarado in command of 80 Spaniards and several hundred Tlaxcalan allies. Alvarado was brave but impulsive, lacking Cortés's political subtlety. In May 1520, during the festival of Toxcatl honouring Huitzilopochtli, Aztec nobles requested permission to celebrate in the temple courtyard. Alvarado agreed, but grew nervous watching the elaborate ceremonies. Whether from fear, greed for the gold ornaments worn by celebrants, or preemptive strategy, Alvarado ordered an attack. Spanish soldiers sealed the courtyard exits and slaughtered the unarmed participants. Hundreds of Tenochtitlan's highest nobility died in what became known as the Temple Massacre. The city exploded in rage. The population that had tolerated Spanish presence for months now sought blood vengeance. Warriors surrounded the palace where Spaniards sheltered. They cut the aqueducts providing fresh water. They destroyed the bridges on the causeways. They launched continuous attacks, their arrows and stones darkening the sky. Alvarado's men could barely hold the palace walls. Moctezuma's attempts to calm his people were ignored. His authority had evaporated. Meanwhile, Cortés defeated Narvaez through a combination of surprise attack and bribery. Most of Narvaez's men joined Cortés, swelling his forces to over 1,300 Spaniards plus thousands of indigenous allies. Cortés rushed back to Tenochtitlan, entering the city on June 24, 1520. He found a desperate situation. The Spanish were besieged, running low on food and water. The Aztecs had selected a new leader, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, who organized fierce resistance. Cortés tried negotiating through Moctezuma, but the emperor's influence had vanished. When Moctezuma appeared on the palace walls to address his people, they pelted him with stones and arrows. The man who had been semi-divine was now despised as a traitor. Moctezuma died 3 days later. Spanish accounts claim he succumbed to wounds from the stoning. Aztec sources suggest the Spanish killed him when his usefulness ended. The truth died with him. The situation became untenable. Cortés decided to flee Tenochtitlan under cover of darkness. The night of June 30th, 1520, became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The Spanish loaded themselves with stolen gold and attempted to escape across the western causeway, but the Aztecs were waiting. Warriors attacked from canoes on both sides. The portable bridge the Spanish built to cross gaps in the causeway collapsed under weight and panic. The causeway became a killing ground. Weighted down with gold, Spaniards drowned in the lake. Horses stumbled and fell into the water. Aztec warriors pulled men from the causeway to be sacrificed later. The rearguard was annihilated. Tlaxcalan allies died by the thousands. Perhaps 600 Spaniards and 2,000 indigenous allies perished. Cortés reportedly wept beneath a tree in Tacuba, mourning his losses. The survivors, wounded and demoralized, fled toward Tlaxcala. The Aztecs had won a crushing victory, but they didn't pursue effectively. Perhaps they believed the threat was eliminated. Perhaps they were exhausted from the fighting. Perhaps they needed to restore religious and political order. This failure to destroy the Spanish completely would prove fatal. In Tlaxcala, Cortés regrouped. Reinforcements arrived from Cuba and Jamaica. New indigenous allies joined, sensing opportunity in Tenochtitlan's weakness. But the deadliest Spanish ally was already at work. Smallpox, introduced by one of Narvaez's men, spread through Tenochtitlan like wildfire. The virgin population had no immunity. People developed fever, then painful pustules covering their bodies. Many died within days. Others survived but were left scarred and blind. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be burned or buried. The stench of death filled the city. Cuitlahuac, who had led the resistance so effectively, died of smallpox after ruling only 80 days. The disease killed indiscriminately warriors, priests, nobles, commoners. Families were destroyed. Knowledge was lost as experienced leaders died. The social fabric unraveled. Traditional medicine offered no relief. Priests declared the gods had abandoned them. The psychological impact matched the demographic catastrophe. Perhaps a third of Tenochtitlan's population died in the epidemic. Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's nephew, became the last Aztec emperor in January 1521. Only 25 years old, he faced an impossible situation. The city was devastated by disease. Many subject cities had rebelled or joined the Spanish. The economy was shattered, but Cuauhtémoc refused to surrender. He organized the survivors, strengthened defenses, and prepared for siege. He removed the causeway's bridges and stationed warriors in strategic positions. He stockpiled food and weapons. He would fight to the end. Cortés spent months preparing for the final assault. He had 13 brigantines built, small ships that could dominate the lake. He gathered over 900 Spaniards and perhaps 150,000 indigenous allies, mainly Tlaxcalans who saw the chance to destroy their ancient enemy. He cut the aqueducts supplying Tenochtitlan with fresh water. He positioned forces at all causeway entrances. The siege of Tenochtitlan began on May 26, 1521. The siege lasted 93 days of continuous horror. Spanish brigantines controlled the lake, preventing food or reinforcements from reaching the city. Cannon fire demolished buildings. Spanish and Allied forces pushed down the causeways, fighting for every foot. The Aztecs resisted with desperate courage. They built barricades from rubble. They dug pitfalls lined with stakes. They fought with stones and wooden clubs when obsidian weapons were exhausted. As the siege progressed, conditions in Tenochtitlan became apocalyptic. Fresh water was gone. People drank brackish lake water, causing disease. Food supplies exhausted. People ate leather, bark, and grass. Some resorted to cannibalism. Bodies rotted in the streets because the living lacked strength to move them. Disease continued spreading. The beautiful city became a charnel house. Spanish tactics were deliberately cruel. They destroyed buildings systematically, filling canals with rubble to create paths for horses and cannon. They burned the great libraries and archives. They toppled the temple pyramids. They showed no mercy to civilians. Women and children were enslaved or killed. The Tlaxcalan allies, nursing generations of hatred, took particular vengeance. The destruction was not just military but cultural, aimed at erasing Aztec civilization. Cuauhtémoc fought with extraordinary courage. He refused multiple offers to surrender. He led counterattacks personally. He maintained discipline among starving, diseased troops. He moved continuously to avoid capture. Even as the city crumbled around him, he embodied resistance. His example inspired defenders to fight beyond human endurance. Streets were defended until every defender died. Buildings were held until they collapsed. By August, the Spanish controlled most of Tenochtitlan. The surviving Aztecs were compressed into the Tlatelolco district. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape by canoe but was captured. He was brought before Cortés and supposedly said, "I have done everything in my power to defend my kingdom and free it from your hands. Since fortune has not favoured me, take my life. This would be just, and with this, everything will end." Cortés initially treated Cuauhtémoc with respect, hoping to use him to pacify the population, but Spanish greed soon overcame political calculation. Convinced that hidden treasure existed, Cortés allowed Cuauhtémoc to be tortured. His feet were burned with oil to make him reveal gold's location. Cuauhtémoc endured the torture without providing information. He was eventually hanged in 1525 during a Spanish expedition to Honduras, accused of plotting rebellion. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of Aztec civilization. The city was systematically destroyed. Temples were demolished and their stones used to build churches. Canals were filled to create streets. Indigenous books were burned as satanic. The palace of Moctezuma became the site of Cortés's residence. Mexico City rose on Tenochtitlan's ruins, but the Aztec capital was gone forever. The demographic collapse continued for decades. Smallpox was followed by measles, typhus, and other European diseases. The indigenous population of central Mexico fell from perhaps 15 million to barely 1 million within a century. Entire peoples disappeared. Languages went extinct. Traditional knowledge vanished. The sophisticated agricultural systems collapsed. The complex trade networks disintegrated. A civilization that had developed over millennia was destroyed in a few years. The Spanish imposed their culture with ruthless efficiency. Indigenous religions were banned. Temples became churches. Native books were burned. Children were taken from parents to be raised Christian. Indigenous languages were suppressed in favor of Spanish. Traditional dress was forbidden. Even indigenous names were replaced with Spanish ones. The conquistadors aimed not just to rule but to erase indigenous identity entirely. Yet Aztec influence persisted despite Spanish efforts. Nahuatl words entered Spanish and eventually English: chocolate, tomato, coyote, avocado. Indigenous agricultural techniques continued feeding Mexico. Traditional medicines proved effective and were adopted. Artistic styles influenced colonial architecture. Most importantly, indigenous peoples survived, maintaining aspects of their culture despite centuries of oppression. The conquest's legacy remains controversial. Spanish accounts portrayed it as bringing civilization and Christianity to savage peoples. Indigenous accounts remembered it as apocalyptic destruction. Modern Mexico struggles with this dual heritage, European and indigenous, Catholic and pre-Columbian, Spanish-speaking yet rooted in ancient Mesoamerica. The conquest wounds have not fully healed after 500 years. The story of the Aztecs reminds us that entire civilizations can rise from nothing and fall to nothing in the span of a few centuries. From their humble beginnings in the mythical Aztlan to their wandering years as despised nomads, from the founding of Tenochtitlan on swampy islands to the creation of an empire stretching from sea to sea, the Aztecs demonstrated human capacity for adaptation, achievement, and ambition. They built floating gardens that fed hundreds of thousands. They created art that still takes our breath away. They developed philosophy and poetry that explored the deepest questions of existence. They understood the movements of celestial bodies with stunning precision. They organized one of the world's most complex societies without wheels, iron tools, or beasts of burden. Their fall came not from internal weakness, but from an unimaginable external shock. The arrival of Europeans carrying diseases that would kill millions and possessing military technologies that rendered traditional warfare obsolete. In just 2 years, the mighty Aztec Empire collapsed before a few hundred Spanish adventurers, aided by indigenous allies and invisible pathogens. Tenochtitlan, once the jewel of the Americas, was reduced to rubble. The last emperor was tortured and hanged. The temples were torn down and churches built from their stones. Yet the Aztec legacy endures. Their language still speaks through millions of Nahuatl speakers. Their agricultural innovations still feed Mexico. Their art influences contemporary creators. Their story reminds us that human civilization is both resilient and fragile, capable of extraordinary achievements and vulnerable to sudden catastrophe. The Aztecs were not perfect. Their practice of human sacrifice shocks us. Their imperial expansion caused suffering. Their rigid hierarchy created inequality. But they were human beings who loved their children, honored their gods, created beauty, sought knowledge, and built a civilization that amazed even their conquerors. Today, Mexico City, one of the world's largest metropolises, sits atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Subway construction regularly uncovers Aztec artifacts. The Templo Mayor stands exposed in the city's heart, a reminder of what was. The National Museum of Anthropology preserves the sunstone, featherwork, and countless other treasures. Indigenous peoples maintain traditions stretching back to before the conquest. The Aztecs are not merely historical figures, but ancestors whose influence shapes the present. Their story offers lessons for our own time. They show how environmental challenges can spark innovation, creating productive agriculture in swampland. They demonstrate how political alliances can multiply power, the Triple Alliance conquering where individual cities could not. They warn how disease can destroy societies, smallpox killing more than swords ever could. They reveal how cultural misunderstanding can lead to catastrophe, Spanish and Aztec worldviews proving mutually incomprehensible. They remind us that no empire, however mighty, is permanent. The Aztecs also challenge us to see beyond European perspectives of history. For too long, their story was told primarily through Spanish sources, portraying them as bloodthirsty savages needing civilization. Modern scholarship, incorporating indigenous sources and archaeological evidence, reveals a far more complex picture. The Aztecs were sophisticated urbanists, innovative engineers, subtle philosophers, skilled artists, and effective administrators. Their civilization was different from European models, but not inferior. As we face our own global challenges, climate change, pandemic disease, cultural conflict, technological disruption, the Aztec experience offers both warnings and inspiration. They adapted to difficult environments through innovation. They created stability through effective governance. They found meaning through religious and philosophical systems. They expressed humanity through art and poetry. They failed when confronted with unprecedented challenges, but their failure was not from lack of courage or intelligence, but from facing circumstances no society could have anticipated or prevented. The Aztecs remind us that human civilization is an ongoing experiment, always vulnerable, always adapting, always creating new forms from the ruins of the old. Their pyramids may be ruins, their codices mostly burned, their empire vanished, but their spirit endures in the descendants who still honor their memory, in the scholars who still study their achievements, in the artists who still draw inspiration from their aesthetics, and in all of us who recognize in their story the universal human struggle to create meaning and beauty in an uncertain world. This has been the complete story of the Aztecs, from their legendary origins in Aztlan through their rise to imperial power to their tragic fall before Spanish conquistadors. They were warriors and poets, engineers and artists, priests and merchants, parents and children. They built one of history's great civilizations in one of the world's most challenging environments. They created beauty that still moves us and knowledge that still serves us. They faced their destruction with courage that still inspires us. They were not myths or legends, but real people who lived, loved, struggled, achieved, and ultimately fell, leaving behind a legacy that will endure as long as humans remember the past and learn from it. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Aztec history. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of history's most fascinating civilizations, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me continue bringing these deep dives into history's greatest stories. Until next time, remember that every civilization, including our own, is writing its chapter in the endless human story. Peace and wisdom to you all.